Well, thank you, George. You know who I am and what I'm going to talk about, so move ahead. The trick here is we want models that look as scale as we can make them, but that sail well in at least moderate breezes. And I'm going to assume for the purpose of the talk that you're all willing to tolerate some sort of modest compromises in the design in order to enable good sailing. And this will apply whether you're starting with a full-size boat, scaling it down to a model size, or whether you're going up from one model to another, or down, say, from a vintage Marblehead to a vintage 36. So why do we need to talk about it?
I can take your next one.
Thank you. Why do we need to talk about it? Why can't you just take it to the copy machine and reduce the size? Well, it turns out it just doesn't work that well, and the talk is going to make you understand why that is and what we can do to mitigate the problem. Oops. Okay. The fundamental concept, and I'm going to beat on this fairly hard for a few slides, but the fundamental concept is that we're going to imagine scaling by some factor. I'll pick 10 to make the arithmetic easy. And that means that every linear dimension on the boat, the length, the waterline length, the beam, the draft, the luff of the sail, the foot of the sail, all those will get scaled by that same factor of 10. And that's what happens when you build a display model. It looks real because, in fact, every dimension has been adjusted. But, two buts. The sail area is going to go down by the square of that factor, and the displacement is going to go down by the cube. And that's the topic I'm going to beat on. All right. Think back to high school geometry. And I'm going to talk about a simplified version of a sail, a simple triangle. And the area of that triangle is 1/2 the base times the altitude. Remember? Mm-hmm. In this case, it's 1/2 the luff times the foot. That's the area of the full-size model. If we scale it by a factor of 10, we're going to divide the luff by 10, the foot by 10. When we do the arithmetic here, it comes out luff times foot divided by 100. 100 is the square of the scale factor 10. So you can see here that we've taken the original sail area and divided it by the square of the sail factor. Now, to talk about displacement, first I want to set the stage for what I mean by displacement. It's the amount of water, it's the volume of whatever is beneath the waterline in the boat. And that means it's the amount of water that gets displaced when you try to float the boat. And if high school physics, Archimedes said that the weight of the displaced water equals the weight of the boat. The other way to think of the experiment is take a tub full of water, brim full of water, put the boat in it. Obviously water will overflow. If you capture all that water and weigh it, that's the weight of the boat. Now, I've talked about displacement in those terms of weight mostly, but it also is volume. It's, in our case, cubic inches of volume below the waterline, and we can relate that to weight because we know the density of water. Salt water weighs 64 pounds per cubic foot. In a more meaningful number for us would be 0.037 pounds per cubic inch. So if we know the cubic inches beneath the waterline, then we will know the weight of the boat that will displace that much water if it floats at its waterline. It's not an academic question because we're talking about scale models here. So one of the key attributes is you got to get the freeboard right. I mean, you know, this distance, which means you have to know where the water line is, and you better get it right when you're building it because that's one of the most obvious visible attributes of the finished model. Okay. So now we'll do the same kind of arithmetic as we did for sail area, but apply it to displacement. And I've got here a real simple, real ugly boat, but it's a rectangular solid with a waterline length, a beam, and a draft. The dotted line is the waterline. And the volume beneath the waterline is the length times the draft times the beam. And if we do the same, divide each of those dimensions by 10, and then rearrange the terms, we'll show that the original volume is, the scaled model becomes the original volume divided by the cube of that factor of 10 for displacement. And of course, I will assert that the same principles apply to the more complex shapes of the boats we actually built. Now, I mean, I could almost stop. That's the talk. Everything else is commentary and examples. But I beat on that because you really need to internalize it. That's kind of a brutal arithmetic when you start applying it to models, as we will see next. So this is a really extreme example. I started with a J class. I picked Rainbow because I had the plans for Rainbow. And I reduced it to vintage 36 size. And in fact, this is it here. And so now the scale factor, since Rainbow is about 129 feet long, the scale factor works out to be about 43. So that's a big scaling problem. And so we started. So the length goes down to 3 feet because that was the point of the exercise. The waterline length reduced accordingly, the beam. Oops, there are a couple things here that are really alarming, so I put them in red. The draft scales down to a little over 4 inches. Now that's probably not practical for a vintage 36. But it gets worse. The displacement, doing that cube of the scale factor thing, goes down to 4 pounds. Now, I maintain that that's just plain unbuildable. You're going to need more than that in ballast. The sail area turns out to be quite close to the vintage 36 sail area, and you should not take comfort in that. That's actually part of the problem. The original was really over-canvassed by typical boat practice, and the vintage 36 at 600 square inches is no sissy on over-canvassing either. So the fact that it turned out to be close to the 600 square inches were allowed actually meant even more worry for getting a scale boat that would work. So this is what I did for the model. And this is the major cheats are here in the draft, where I practically doubled the draft, and the displacement, where I actually a little bit more than doubled the displacement. And that was to enable enough ballast and enough stability. I mean, if we're going to add ballast and still float on the waterline, the only thing we can do is add volume beneath the waterline. And that's what shows up here in the added displacement and the volume that enables it. All right, now let's look at some less extreme examples. Same boat, Rainbow, scaled 1/16th and then 1/23rd. 1/16th is the scale for the AMYAJ class. And if you look at that, you can see that scaling Rainbow, just the way we've done, works out kind of reasonable numbers. The weight of 70 to 80 pounds is what you'd expect. The draft is deep, but not excessive, and the J class allows, the model J class allows you to extend the draft a little bit. This number would probably be considered the maximum that the AMYAJ class would allow, and in decent breezes, they'd probably use a reduced size rig. Just for my own entertainment, I redesigned it at 1/23rd scale, which works out to be a little bit under 6 feet, and that's this boat here. And it worked out to be a reasonable sort of size and shape. The weight is not unmanageable. This sail area troubled me, and in fact, the way I got stability in this mostly was by putting a 1,300 square inch sail on it rather than that 2,000 square inch sail. Because, again, stability. The weight went down too fast for the sail area. Another example, and this is going to point us to some boats that are easier to scale than others. Let's consider 12 meters. I didn't have the plans for the EC12, but I did have plans for Weatherly, which was a 12 meter, so therefore a similar boat. And the scale factor that the EC12 uses is 9/10 of an inch equals 1 foot, which works out to be a little bit more than a factor of 13. And if you take the original Weatherly, which was, a 12 meter, 67 foot boat, and these are typical 12 meter weights, the scaling works out to a not unreasonable number. In fact, it is quite similar to the EC12 class. The waterline length is about the same, draft is about the same, weight is about the same. The sail area, strictly scaled, is a bit bigger. The EC12s are like 1,200 or 1,300. And that 15% or so reduction is that class's attempt to get extra stability compared to a strictly scaled boat. So there's precedent all over the place for doing the things I'm arguing in favor of. Now, I believe that 12-meter boats scale more readily than some of the other old designs because they were relatively heavy and relatively conservatively rigged to start with. I mean, they sailed wonderfully, but they were not high-powered in sail area displacement ratio metrics. They were not high-powered boats. So another scale is people talk about having favorite vintage marbleheads. Couldn't we scale them down to vintage 36? The answer is yes, with some care. In fact, yesterday, until my rudder died, I was sailing one such, and maybe tomorrow I'll be able to sail it again. But I started with the Mad Hatter design, which is a Roger Stollery design that we have plans for on our website, and it's distinguished by this cross sections are completely curved. There's no sharp edge between the deck and the sheer, or the deck and the topsides. And so to scale from 50 down to 36, the scale factor is 0.72, which is not really aggressive. But even at that, the scaled sail area goes down to 415 square inches. And we know that the vintage 36 class permits 600 square inches. So this would not be a competitive boat if it were strictly scaled. And the scale displacement it was 16 pounds in the Marblehead size, and it goes down to 6 pounds, which again, I think is essentially unbuildable in a vintage 36 to be a successful practical model. So, how do we deal with that? Let me first summarize what I think are if you're considering scaling down a model, what are the trigger points that should generate your questions? First of all is the relative weight and sail area of the full-size boat. We saw that the 12 meters scaled more readily than the J boats, and the J boats were probably even easier than some of the earlier America's Cup boats. I suspect that working schooners would probably be sensibly rigged, and therefore might be good candidates for scaling without a lot of work in the underbody. The model class may impose some issues. If you want to make it a V36, for instance, you've got maximum sail area, you've got maximum draft, and there may be specifications not only in the draft but on the aspect ratio of the keel. Usually there's a minimum chord width that they require. Sail area displacement is a metric that is often published in the literature, in popular sailing magazines when they describe new boats. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that applies to models. Okay, and just in case, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Somehow we got, can you back up a couple? Yeah. Stop. One, forward one? Yeah. Okay. This business of not being able to do strict scaling, that grates on some people, which is why I keep building right here. But even in the literature, it's easy to find references that point out that strictly scaled models are usually over canvas if you try to sail them. There's a book I think is just wonderful, and that's E.W. Hobbs's book, Model Sailing Boats. It's probably 100 years old, but it's a really excellent treatise on building models, and one of the points he makes is the same thing about the difficulty of the scale models. So, straightforward scaling is unlikely to produce a satisfactory boat. You're going to modify the design. Okay. I said we were going to talk about, briefly about sail area displacement ratio. That's the definition. It's the sail area measured in square feet, divided by the displacement in pounds. That's where you usually enter it, because that's the number that's usually specified when boats are being advertised. And then you divide that displacement in pounds by 64. Remember, that's the density of salt water. So that converts the pounds displacement to cubic feet. And if you take that to the 2/3 power, you get square feet as the dimension at the bottom. If you didn't follow the arithmetic, don't worry, that's the formula. But it is a dimensionless number. Both the numerator and denominator end up with units of square feet. Dimensionless number means that it's the same for all sizes. So your model boat will have exactly the same sail area displacement ratio as the full-size boat, if you strictly scale it. That does not mean it has the same stability. Stability is a function of a whole lot of other things, like angular momentum, for instance, because how quickly does it respond to pups, and that's how much the boat weighs. I mean, it's sort of fundamental. Big boats are more stable than little boats. Even full-size big boats are more stable than full-size smaller boats. And remember the Fastnet race of some years ago when there was some loss of life and loss of boats. The small boats suffered more, and that's simple physics. Well, not simple, but physics. I think sail area displacement could be considered more of a metric of liveliness. It's like horsepower to weight ratio in a car, but it's a little bit related to stability, but it's not a determinant. All right, so just for numbers here, full-size models, full-size boats, the Rainbows would have a sail area, Rainbow J-class, I'm sorry, would have a sail area displacement ratio of about 26. And that's well into the race boat category by modern standards. The 12 meters would be more moderate, and they'd be sail area displacement of about 19. And today that would be considered a lively cruising boat, but not a full-out race boat. And I don't have data on full-size schooners, but if someone does, send it to me, because I suspect that they would be relatively conservative also. Now, some sailing models. This one, the 6-foot Rainbow, has a sail area of about 18, which is more like the 12 meter. It's certainly not as aggressive as the full-size J boat. My smaller Rainbow, this one, is only 15. Again, smaller. I thought I had to be more conservative about that. The EC12 class is 17, which compares. It's a little bit more conservative than the full-size 12 meter, but it's comparable. And the J class, the same way, just a tiny bit more conservative, but very comparable. Although both those classes permit smaller rigs when you need to, so that's their workaround. All right, to apply all this, you've got to look at the lines drawings of the boat, and I love these lines. Okay, this is Rainbow. It's a Starling Burgess design. These are his drawings, and our models won't have those many lines in them, but all the elements are there. There's the profile view, the sections view here, and the top half of this is the water lines, which are lines that, these horizontal lines run this way. And those are the key elements of any set of plans. Those would be the elements of what you buy if you ordered plans from our website. And they're what we manipulate to make the changes we need to make, and these are the things that instruct us in what the shape will end up being. So these are same drawings but simplified. This is more like what we would buy for models. Again, the profile and the sections and the water lines. Now the profile shows vertical lines here, and those correspond to these sections. It's normal practice that the right half of this would be the forward sections of the boat. The left half of this would be the after sections of the boat. So this may look sort of symmetrical at first blush, but it's not. Each of these is a unique section, and we only draw half of them because that's all the information you need to live in your image. Now there are these lines, these horizontal lines. The main one is this one right here, which is the load water line. And those get, if imagine if you slice the boat, this way, right? And so as you get down here, these lines are going to reveal the underbody shape, and that's what we're seeing here. This curve that I'm trying to trace out is the load water line. This one is a parallel line to that, but below it by this distance. And then there's another one here and here, and the outer one here is the shear line, the deck line. And you can see right away there's some odd things happening. See these funny little curves back here? The water line comes around like this, the lower ones come in like this, and that's what's going on in the back of the boat here, in front of the rudder post. And it's a characteristic of full keel boats like this, that back here, the shape changes dramatically. And that, we're going to talk a little bit more about how I worry about that. But here it's revealed and it's pretty brutally. Can we go back one?
Yeah.
You can see Starling Burgess, there's some of that, but much less. This was a boat with a less underbody volume than the next one. And one of the consequences of that is the shape. Okay, let's go on. I've talked about most of this, I think. The three views, one, the profile, the sections, and the water lines. Let's go ahead one. The profile view, I did not show buttocks. Can we go back to?
Yep.
These vertical lines here, these are lines I'm talking about that would slice the boat parallel to the center line, only moved out toward the maximum beam point. And when you plot them viewed, so you make that cut and then you view it, right? So if you did, the profile comes out like this, but these others would be smaller and follow curves like this. And that shows kind of how the water's got to flow when it's passing under the boat. But it also, deeper, heavier boats, with these buttock lines would curve down more. And that's a warning. I mean, sometimes you just have to do it to get the volume you talk about, but that will have impact on wave making and therefore on speed. So I'm going to beat on that again a little bit more, but I want you to try to remember, when I talk about the buttocks lines, it's this curve here that I'm talking about. The slices parallel to the center line of the boat, but further out. Okay, ahead. One more. And one more. Okay, the sections. The sections are the slices, across like this. And clearly we use those as the basis for our frames or our molds when we're setting up the building board. Those sections are usually drawn to the outside of the planking. In fact, I think almost always, and if they're not done, there'll be a warning on the lines that they're not done to the outside. They have to be done to the outside because they're used for calculating volume. So you want to know the volume of the underbody, you got to go to the outside of the boat. When you use those as the basis for your frames, you got to remember to take away the thickness of whatever planking you're going to use. So I typically use 1/8" planking, so I'll lay out the sections full size and then reduce them all the way around by the 1/8" thickness of the planking. The number of sections is almost, at least for traditional design practices, will be an even number along the waterline. You have an even number of sections evenly spaced along the waterline. And that, the number is a designer's choice, but that enables displacement calculations. I won't have time to go through that, but one of the articles I wrote in our journal talked about some displacement calculations. The key thing is Simpson's rule. If you want to look that up, look up Simpson's rule in something like Skeen's Elements of Yacht's Design, and it'll talk about how and why we need to do the sections like this. We might want to add extra sections on the drawing and in our frames. Back in these areas where we saw how the lines changed, and if you want to add them, you can do it if you think through how the drawings work, look at the profile, look at the waterlines views, and make yourself a new set of sections in between the ones that the designer provided. Okay, I think I didn't talk about diagonals, but we can go ahead. Okay. I think designing boats in for sissies. It's tricky. It's not like houses where everything's straight lines. The only straight lines on the plans are the reference grids, which don't show up in the boat anyway. So all of those curved lines have to be fair individually. They also have to relate well to each other, so that relate perfectly to each other, so that if the width of the water line, as shown on the water lines view here, shown in that view, that has to match the width of the water line shown in the sections view. And so the typical design process would be you start with a profile, because that's the thing you think of first, and then maybe you draw the middle section, the biggest section, and try to get some idea of the shape of the boat. And then you start filling in other water lines and other sections. And after a while, unless you're lucky or more skilled than I, you box yourself into a corner and some of those lines don't make nice fair curves anymore. And of course, if you fix up that one that wasn't fair, then you gotta go back and chase down all those changes that you have to make in the other three views to make it work. So get yourself a big eraser, because it's a lot of redoing. And after you're all done and you think the lines are really pretty and you've drawn your water line, then you get to calculate the displacement. And if it isn't as big, or if it's too big, then you get to do it over. So if you undertake this, even for modest things like scaling, where you have a pretty good starting point, it's still an iterative process. These are the lines drawings for the Vintage 36 Rainbow, which was the most aggressive scaling of anything I've talked about. And you can see, if you try to hark back to Starling Burgess' original lines, you can see some changes. First of all, the good news. If this is the water line here, and above the water line, it looks like a J-boat. That's almost an exact scale of his above the water line period. Below the water line, in profile, now you can see that it's much deeper than the scale would have been. And you can see that, this is it, you can see that here. This is even deeper relatively than the larger boat. And the sections, his sections would have curved in a little bit more, but to get volume, I brought these down more like this. So the whole trick here was to gain necessary stability by both increasing the draft and increasing the volume below the waterline. And that's what happened to the plans. And I had alerted you before about the impact on the buttocks lines. I have one buttocks line only drawn, but see it curves down like this. Mm-hmm. That's a much steeper curve than the other one, and that's also a consequence of having to get the necessary volume. Okay, now I'll go ahead one. All right, and these are the two boats sailing. And so this is a 6-footer and this is the 3-footer. Not particularly heavy wind, but you can see here, look at I'm trying to trace out the wave train. See the bow wave comes up here right at the start of the water line, and then there's a fairly deep trough, even at this low wind speed. And then the stern wave comes up at the end of the water line. And that is a fairly big wave train for a boat that size, and that's because it's fairly heavy for a boat that size. And that'll impact the speed of the boat in the way I'm going to come to a little bit, but try to keep that wave train in mind. Okay. One more? It's loading? Okay. Yeah, this one will be slow, I think. All right, and now this is the boat I called April Bunny, which was derived from Roger Silver's Mad Hatter. And as I said when I talked about it first, the visual cue for this boat is the complete roundness of the sections. Not round, but the lack of hard edges in any of the sections. And so this is, I'm going to show you this a little bit deeper than his. But in general, this made a fairly successful Vintage 36. And now let's go ahead. And here is clear what I did. The solid line is Roger's Marblehead scaled down to 3 feet, just shrunken on the copy machine. And the dashed lines are my modifications to it. And the main one here is it's deeper in draft. And that picked up the bit of extra volume I needed to get the 6 pounds scale displacement up to about 8 or 8.5 pounds that I used for the model itself. Now the draft is also deeper, and that had nothing to do with the scale problem. It's just an artifact or an oddity of our class rules. The draft limit for the traditional Marblehead is 12 inches, and the draft limit for the Vintage 36 is 11 inches. And that means that the Vintage 36s are actually proportionally deeper. So not being completely stupid, I took advantage of that and gave it a 10.5-inch draft, and I also made the rudder a little bigger. But the big effect here is the change in the underbody to give me a little extra volume. Okay, I think we've done this enough. Appearance. We want it to look scale as much as we can, but we're sacrificing scale appearance on the shelf so that it'll have some chance of acting like a scale boat when it's in the water. And so as many of the changes as possible are going to be in the underbody. We could reduce sail area, and if we're concerned about our arguments to make it a scale boat, we could consider it a first reef. There's another issue though, and that's the backstay problem. Most of these old boats had long booms extending out past the transom, which meant that they had running backstays. Well, I mean, I suppose we could do it, but it would really be awkward in a model. So one of the ways you can reduce sail is to shorten the boom. And that means you could then put in a permanent backstay. So that's the thing, I think the EC12s do that, for instance. And that's like step number one to make a practical model. Give yourself a permanent backstay and reduce the sail area. And also, when the boat heels, the long boom tends to drag in the water. Now the old boats either didn't have boom bangs or they had a crew member there who was ready to release the bang and let the boom ride up when it hits. We don't. When our booms drag, we got a problem. First of all, you can't ease the sail out anymore, and secondly, you can't steer. And the last thing is helm balance. And by that I mean weather helm versus lee helm. If you reduce the sail area, there's a risk you'll change the center of effort of the sail plan unless you're careful. If you change that center of effort, you will screw up the helm balance. So as you're reducing, pay attention to that, where the center of effort was. I don't have time to get into calculating the center of effort, it's not very hard, but I think I discussed it in at least one of my articles, and it may be in a tech topic in the future. Now, the hull changes, the real issue is how do we avoid compromising the appearance? And I think the first step is to identify what are the most important visual characteristics of the model you're trying to do. At J-boats, the visual characteristics are long overhangs, bow and stern, right? I mean, that's a biggie. The shape of the shear, the amount of freeboard, the shape of the bow. And all that stuff is above the waterline, and you want to try to preserve it. I maintain you can compromise below the waterline, and at least in the water, it'll still look like a scale boat. And again here, particularly in freeboard, you really have to know where the waterline is, which is why all this fussing about the displacement in the drawings is not just pedantic. Okay. Now, if you change the underbody of the hull, as I maintain you have to, there's great risk that you'll screw up the helm balance that way, because the hull has a center of lateral resistance, which you can think of as where on this boat would you push so that it'll translate sideways without twisting. If I push here, obviously the bow is going to go back. If I push here, the stern is going to go back. If I push somewhere in the middle, then it will translate sideways. That's the center of lateral resistance, which balances the sail's center of effort. But it isn't quite that simple. The way I just described it would make you think you want to put the sail's center of effort right over top of the center of lateral resistance. No. And the reason no is boats typically sail heel. When they heel, the sail center of effort will move off to the leeward side of the boat, right? And when it does, that'll generate a turning torque. So if this boat is heeled toward me, and the sail's out here, it's going to tend to turn it into the wind, which we weather helm. Now, a little of that is good, a lot of it is bad. But in order to avoid that being a dominant problem for steering, typically the center of effort of the sail is moved forward of the center of lateral resistance of the hull. And the amount is tricky to determine, and designers frequently get it wrong. And it's one of the reasons we have adjusted the mast positions, right? A starting point, I think, would be put it maybe 15% of the length of the low water line forward, the sail center of effort forward of the center of lateral resistance of the hull. And determining the sail center of effort is easy geometrically. Determining the underbody resistance is harder. The old non-techie way is to on stiff cardboard, trace out the underbody and balance it on a ruler held perpendicular to the waterline, and that's the point where the center of lateral resistance would be. Okay, other hull changes. Oops, I did that. Could you go back one? I did that. Boat speed is proportional to the square root of the waterline, period. That's just physics. The proportionality constant is often written in magazines as 1.34. That's sort of a good starting point. That's the speed of a wavelength of water traveling through the water. The wavelength itself will propagate at 1.34 times the square root of that wavelength. Incidentally, that's why tsunamis travel so fast. They're huge. The wavelength might be miles long, but and so the propagation speed is quick. Of relevance for our boats, think back to the picture I harped on that had the wave train down the side. So at hull speed, the wave would go up at the bow, hollow in the middle of the boat, and back up at the stern. If you try to make the boat, and that wave has to propagate along with the boat as it's moving. If you try to make the boat go faster than that, now that means the wavelength will extend out past the stern. The stern's going to drop down to the hollow. The boat will assume a bow up attitude as it tries to climb out of its own bow wave. That's what planing boats do. Sailboats, especially model sailboats, rarely. So we're sort of trapped in that wavelength. Now, how much we're trapped depends on how heavy the boat is. And because the heavier the boat, the bigger that wave, the more of that trough. So things like catamarans, which can have long, narrow hulls and are light, can probably get away with more than 1.34 times the square root of the waterline length. They might get up to 2. And barges might be 0.7 or 0.8, I really don't know. But and I would guess for our models that 1.1, 1.2 times the square root of the waterline length is about as fast as we're going to go, over and out, period. And they look fast, but they're not really. Okay, the last point I did sort of hit on. Oh, comments about building. First of all, how many frames? It's sort of your call. It depends somewhat on how much stress is in the model, but I tend to make them at least every 5 inches. And some people, I tend to leave the frames in and make them ring frames. Other people don't bother with making them ring frames and then remove them when the hull is planked, and both ways work. I'm an advocate of extra frames in any area where the hull changes shape. Like, back here where on full keel boats back at the rudder post area. The strong points really have to be the keel, the mast support, the chain plate, and the jib attachment areas. And I try to tie them together. The frames in that area are tied to the keel, all glued up. And the rest of the boat can be quite light. The rest of the boat keeps the water out, but that's where the stresses are. And of course, we got to worry about where the hatch is. You want to determine the center of gravity, and then the hatch desirably is pretty close to that, so that all your heavy stuff like batteries and the sail servo and stuff can be over the center of gravity. Now, center of gravity is often marked on plans, but not always. But usually, especially if they don't have it, they'll put what's called the lateral center of buoyancy, LCB. And that's where it's like gravity, only the opposite. You know what center of gravity is? If you pick it up at that's the balance point where you pick it up. You can imagine all the weight concentrated at the center of gravity. The center of lateral buoyancy is the same thing, except it's what's pushing up. It's where the upward flotation forces concentrate. And you do want them right over top of the other. If you don't, like if you put the ballast too far back, then the bow's going to go up. And that's, so if the plans show the lateral center of buoyancy, that's your center of gravity. And you don't even have to float the boat. You can just pick it up on a string attached at that point, and if it balances in the air, it'll balance in the water. Okay, next slide. Framing. These are pictures along the way for both these boats. And you can see back here, I put in an extra frame at this rudder post area, and back in here, I put in a couple extra frames. And that was just to help me get the bending of the planks under control. If you don't do that, it'll probably work, but the shape won't be as defined as you might like, and maybe adjacent planks won't be so easy to get lined up. And if you only have 1/8 of an inch to work with, there's a limited amount of sanding you can do. All right, and this is a picture of one of them sailing. And I think I'm going to stop now. There are other slides. If you want to see print of this, I don't know whether it'll be available, but if you send me an email, and my email is always in the magazine, I'll then have your return address and I'll send you slides. And there's some other slides that do talk about displacement calculations and center buoyancy calculations and things like that. Anyway, I think the next slide is not, right, that's it. So, thank you for your attention. I don't know, John, do we have time for questions, or?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I had two questions. First off, when you're doing your actual design work, after your calculations, are you using pencil and paper or CAD?
Oh, how do I do it?
Yes.
Well, I have a big table, and I have flexible battens and ship's curves and stuff like that. But the calculations for displacement involve knowing the area of the sections.
Right.
And then you enter that in the Simpson's formula, and it turns into volume. And Simpson's formula, by the way, is essentially an integration.
Right.
Integration, I mean like calculus, but it's numeric integration because we can't write an analytic function for the curve. To measure that area, the best tool is a planimeter, which is hard to find anymore and very expensive, and I don't own one. So the second best is graph paper, translucent graph paper with a grid on it. And literally I have some of that, and I lay it over there, and the grid is 1 inch by 1 inch squares, and those are divided into 100 little squares. I count them, and that gives me directly the area of that section, or half section, because I'm using the sections drawings, in square inches. And so then from there I can work to sum up, according to Simpson's rule, each of those section areas, and that turns into the underbody volume, and therefore the weight for displacement.
Yeah, because if you look in some of the vintage books like John Black's Yachting with Models, you'll see a points chart that that the designer developed, which gives you your waterline, station, and buttock line. And so you would start from a waterline, say waterline 0, and then take measurements up and down, left and right, till you get all of your sections.
Oh, you may be talking about the table of offsets.
That's it.
Yeah, okay, right. Sometimes it's not necessary that you have drawings. If you have a good table of offsets, you can make your own drawings from it. And what that is, literally, is a table of the dimensions at each point on the grids that we would have. The horizontal and vertical lines would show up on our drawings that we purchased. Yeah, that means you're doing the drawing on your own.
Right, and you have to be careful with that, because I tried that on an Excel spreadsheet and taking those points, and you'd be surprised how off some of those points are. So you've got to be careful.
Yeah. Builders sometimes say bad words about designers. Yeah. And that's, I mean, you read about lofting as a building technique.
Right.
It doesn't really apply to us because we tend to have drawings that are full model size. But if you're building a boat that's 30 feet long, you're not going to get a 30-foot drawing. You're going to get a 3-foot drawing or so, scale by 10. And then the builder, as step one, will have a clean floor that he'll paint white, and he'll lay out those plans full size. And as observed, you'll find out that, yeah, it was close to right. but
My second question is, have you looked at the International A-class rule as far as scaling down?
I have not, no.
You might want to take a look at that.
Yeah.
Because as I look at your large rainbow here, I think it fits into the bottom of the rule.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there may be some differences as far as maybe draft, maybe some sail area, but what's the displacement of the boat?
About 25 pounds.
The average now for the modern A-class boats are around 36 pounds displacement. They're very long, about 72 inches on average. Like I said, your boat would fit into the small.
I could look at that, yeah. I did once, I mean, there's some, doesn't the A-class have, care about how you measure the waterline length? It's not exactly what you would think, it's offset somewhat?
Yes, what you're doing is you measure your overhangs, and that gives you the water line. There's also a quarter beam measurement that's involved in that water line measurement that either is going to give you, it may give you a penalty in some cases, which reduces your sail area. There is a beam measurement at the water line, maximum beam. There are shear measurements at 3 points on the hull. That's all calculated into the rule. And then from that point on, then you can develop your sail area with your fore triangle, which would be your head sail, and then the amount of sail area that you would be allowed on the main. So I think just looking at your boat, what's the square inches of sail?
About 1,300.
Okay, you may fit in.
Okay.
Take a look at that, and just as it is.
One of the interesting things that you just talked about is when boats with long overhangs heel, the claim is that it extends the water line, and that's, so it was supposed to be sort of a way to cheat the rating rule, because those rating rules measure water line length, not overall length. How much you actually gain by that, I'm never sure, but it's one of the reasons that this boat has a slight tumble home. Because you don't want the boat, when it heels over, to then float up, because then you're not gonna get an extension of the water line. The tumble home lets it sink. On the other hand, it doesn't help your stability.
The one problem with the top end of that rule is that you could get a boat that's 80 inches long and 60 to 70 pounds, so you gotta be careful.
Yeah.
For a lot of us,
That's too much for me,
it's too much.
Why don't we do this in the essence of time? If you have other questions for John, catch him sometime during the day today. These presentations are being videotaped. They will be